Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. I'm your host, JP John Poz. With me today, a very special returning guest. He is the author, historian. You may have seen him on the WCW Vice series. He is, of course, the man that is the author of Beyond Nitro, Mr. Guy Evans. Guy, welcome back. How you doing?
Oh, thanks so much. It's great to be here as always, John.
What is going on in your world, and what is going on with Beyond Nitro, the brand new book?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, the response to the book so far is, just been overwhelming. I mean, it's been the highest selling book that I've ever put out on my personal website. Since I got into this back in 2018 with the original Nitro book, and some of the emails I've been receiving from people have just been just so heartwarming, and I'm so glad that people, have really found a lot of value and entertainment in the new book. And as I'm sure we'll get into, it's a different kind of book as compared to Nitro. That was a chronological telling of really the entire WCW story under Turner from beginning to end. Whereas in this particular book, and again, I'm sure we'll go into this in more detail, I'm really looking at aspects of that story that perhaps have escaped, a sufficient amount of consideration in the past, or things that previously haven't been known to the reader. So I think if you enjoyed the Nitro book and you walked away from that book, as I know a lot of people did, saying, wow, there's dozens upon dozens, if not, hundreds of tidbits here that I didn't know before. I think you're going to have the same sort of feeling when you finish Beyond Nitro as well. And that's something that I really try to pride myself on in all the work that I do, is, recognizing that people have, a lot of other entertainment options, a lot of other things they could be doing with their time. So I'm very confident in saying when you finish this near 700-page book, there'll be a lot of stuff about WCW and about wrestling in general that previously you may not have been aware of.
Yeah, that is amazing. Man, it's just crazy. When you kind of first decided to write this, was a
Mhm.
lot of this kind of based off of, okay, when Nitro came out, I have so many more stories to tell. I mean, there's just like too much meat on the bone here.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the best way I can explain it is in doing that first book. In order to keep the story going, I didn't necessarily have the ability to say, okay, now I've mentioned something here about WCW's financial performance, for example. Let me take 8 to 10 pages and really going into a tremendous amount of depth about that. I mean, I was able to do that at certain points in the story, sort of zooming in a little bit and then returning to kind of moving the narrative along. But by adopting this format with Beyond Nitro, I've really been able to, as you said, add a lot of meat to the bone and include a lot of content that, just due to time and space constraints, couldn't make it into the first book. And then, of course, it's been 7 years since the book was initially published. And in those 7 years, I've developed further relationships with people, in WCW or previous employees of WCW, people on the Turner side, people who sort of had a tangential relationship to the business during that time. I've sort of deepened some pre-existing relationships that were already there. People introduced me to even more, even more former employees and staffers and so forth. And then, even though I think in doing the first book, I had a substantial amount of documents and memos and all of those things that people love that made it into that book. I've been able to sort of get my hands on, even more since that time. So just based on my own knowledge of what I left on the cutting room floor the first time, and the additional knowledge, if you like, that I've gained in the last 7 years, and also the feedback that I've got from so many readers over the years saying, I'd love to, I'd love to have more of where that came from. So all of those things really spurred me on in terms of wanting to put together another book. Didn't anticipate it would be, 200,000 words and nearly 700 pages, as I said, but that seems to be the way things go.
Man, crazy. Well, like a lot of stuff to kind of unpack. I mean, you get ton of new info, ton of stuff that's kind of been unearthed. What is kind of like the most surprising thing? I mean, we don't have to go into crazy detail because everybody
Mm.
should obviously go out there and read the book. But what's something that's like a crazy story or a crazy detail that you just kind of just surprised you? in your, obviously 700 pages.
Well, I think the aspect of the book which has generated the most discussion, and I anticipate it will continue to do so in the future, is, you want to talk about a deep dive. I mean, there's two chapters in this book, chapters 12 and 13, where I go through the actual profit and loss statements for WCW as an entity under Turner. So if ever you were interested in what were the actual recorded itemized figures on WCW's books, how were they generating a figure of, for example, a $62.5 million loss in the year 2000, all of that is addressed in, I would say, pretty much unprecedented detail. I mean, one of the things that has been quite interesting over the years is you've had this debate, I think, between various factions as it relates to WCW's financial performance and its ultimate viability as a company under Turner. And there was a group of people who would sort of cite figures that have previously been reported in the media, or draw attention to certain things that have come out in legal disclosures, and in large part, I would say, sort of accept the stated figures that we have encountered in the past, on face value. And then you've had another group of people, and often these tend to be made up of people who actually worked within Turner and WCW to some extent, who have definitely been a little bit more skeptical about that, and sort of cautioned that sometimes you have to take these things with a grain of salt. So seeing as I had access to all of this stuff, I figured, well, it would be very interesting to lay this all out and to reconcile those different perspectives, and to show people not only how these figures were generated, but also the underlying mechanism which impacted the accounting practices within Turner. So I can give you one, very specific example as to what I'm talking about if people are curious. And the example I'm going to give is, I think most people listening to this are familiar with the fact that in 1995, and again, this was covered in the first book, WCW was recognized internally as being a profitable, division. And if you read my first book, you'll see that there's a little bit of additional context there, and there's some other sort of details to that part of the story that probably need to be considered. But the important part is that internally they were recognized as being profitable. And again, as I think most people listening to this will be aware, that was a pattern that continued in 96, in 97. Of course, 98 was really the banner year in terms of profitability, in terms of how that's traditionally been reported. And I think most people have an understanding that in 99, the company was reported as losing money. And if you remember, this is where really between the spring of that year and the fall, you had a pretty, relatively speaking, calamitous drop off in terms of TV ratings and pay-per-view buy rates and just overall interest in WCW as a company. This is when the WWF really was starting to run away with the Monday Night Wars, and the weekly ratings competitions weren't essentially competitive at that time. So I suppose on face value, it's no surprise that in 99, WCW was losing money. Now, the extent of that loss is often debated. There's been numbers reported over the years: 15 million, 20 million, 10 million. The actual net loss that was recorded on the company's finalized income statement, which was produced internally within TBS, was $11.03 million. Okay, so if we just take that number, you could essentially put this matter to bed and say, well, that's an open and shut case. What becomes, I suppose, what is sort of a mitigating factor, or something that absolutely should be considered, though, when I talk about these things? And again, I don't think that this would be sort of front of mind unless you've actually seen the income statements and associated documents which confirm the same, is the fact that excuse me, where costs are recorded in a large corporation such as Turner at that time is really of paramount importance. So if I was to tell you, John, and I know you probably have some insight into this because you've read the book, prior to the Nitro era, the stated marketing costs for WCW as a division within that corporation were around $750,000 per year. Now, that's not to be confused with the actual amount necessarily that was being spent directly on marketing WCW. But in terms of how they were doing their books pre-Nitro, that number was, in 94, for example, it was at $747,000. So just keep that number in mind. So now we go to 1995, where the stated marketing expense for WCW was $1.13 million. 1997, now we're up to $2.195 million. And if you think about sort of the growth of WCW as a company over that time, you can sort of see how the costs would have escalated and things would have continued to move in that direction. Well, by 1999, which is, if I just take you back a few minutes in this conversation, is the year that I was really focusing on. Again, 1999, this is the $11.03 million loss. Marketing expenses for 1999, which had been $2.195 million in 1997, were recorded at $23.85 million, almost $24 million. So that is, if you look at the number in 97, you compare it to 99, that is an increase of 987%. Right now, safe to say the overall budget for TBS's wrestling division had not ballooned by nearly 1,000% over those prior 2 years. So without giving too much away, and this is all broken down in the book, you could even work this out and say, as a theoretical matter, if we were to double WCW's marketing costs on a relative basis, using 97 as a baseline and using the total expense of WCW's operations in 97, which was $103.13 million. In 99, according to the books, the total cost of running that division was $210.2 million. So if we extrapolate from 97 to 99 and then actually double that again, you get a figure of $8.95 million. Okay. So that is to say, in layman terms, to put it simply, you could actually use those stated marketing costs from 1997, look at the broader budgetary expansion, and make an educated guess as to what those costs should have been in 99. You could then take that figure, John, double it, okay, and assume that the company may have been spending, as I said, $8.95 million, almost $9 million by 1999 on marketing, and the company still would have been recognized in 99 as being profitable. So if you follow me, one significant change in cost categorization, where are we recognizing these costs, which are not illusory, by the way, and the book goes into some information I have from a TBS source as to how that actually happened. But this one change was enough to tilt WCW into the red for the entire financial year. Now, keep in mind the scenario that I'm explaining is completely different and separate from a standalone wrestling company. And that's, I think, one of the main things that people have taken away from these two chapters, as I mentioned, which goes into this in a tremendous amount of detail, to try to compare WCW during that time that functioned within this behemoth corporation, and compare that to a wrestling company that has a completely different ownership structure. Just on its face is an exercise that doesn't make any sense. But when you start to appreciate some of these other factors that were at play, I think it gives you an even greater understanding of why these numbers have to be taken with a grain of salt. And I'll end with this, and I appreciate you being patient with my explanation here. By no means, by the way, is any of this saying that there wasn't a significant and obvious drop-off in the quality of WCW's programming in 1999. I mean, 2000, forget about it. We don't even need to talk about that. I think that's been well documented.
Yeah.
That's been well documented at this point. But sometimes two things can be true at the same time. It's possible for a wrestling company such as WCW to have this monumental downturn in terms of its creative output, while also recognizing that clearly things were not, the picture wasn't as bright as it had been in 1998, for example. But again, unless you actually dive into the numbers and you understand and appreciate and talk to people about how these figures were being generated, it's again, it's something that really is a very unique situation that WCW found itself in at that time. But of course, this has very real implications for anyone who was in a position of leadership or authority in the company at that time, because again, just this one change would have tilted WCW into the red for the year. So history would have recorded the company as being profitable there for a fifth straight year, as opposed to losing, as I said, on paper, just over $11 million. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'd love that explanation. That's perfect. Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. And it's fascinating that so many people just say, oh, bad creative in 99, so they must have lost, a ton of money. Like they, you know what I mean? Like they associate the wrong things with making money.
Yes, and I think if we were talking about an independent wrestling company, for example, that sort of level of analysis would make a lot more sense, right? If you and I were 50% owners, co-owners in our own independent company, and we had a full degree of control over what we were spending, what we were taking in. We're not sort of part of a conglomerate where we're being merged with other entities and money can't be moved around. Then we could, quite definitively say at the end of every month or every quarter, this is how we're doing as a business, directly based on our inputs that we're putting into the business. And we could probably draw inferences in terms of what worked this month or this quarter or this year in terms of our storylines, in terms of our promotion, our marketing, social media, so on and so forth. No one's saying that there's no relationship when it comes to WCW in the 90s. I don't think anyone has ever claimed that. But if it was that straightforward, there probably wouldn't have been a need for the books that I've put out on the company. And I think the discussion as it relates to WCW's finances would not have persisted for this long if indeed there weren't those additional factors at play. So again, more than one thing can be true. I don't think anyone with a straight face could say what they were serving up. And everyone, again, this is subjective. Everyone has their point in time where they feel like the wheels, came off the wagon. For some people, they'll say, yeah, Sting, Hogan, that whole debacle, that was the turning point for me. Others might say, yeah, spring of 98, when now we're spinning off the nWo and a lot of the characters are sort of losing focus, and all of a sudden now Sting and Lex Luger are in a version of the nWo and can't really keep track of some of the developments here. Obviously, this is around the time that Thunder started in early '98. Other people, may point to later on after the Goldberg defeat, for example, or early '99. Whatever that point is for you, I've personally never encountered anyone who said, yeah, what they were putting on TV in 99 and 2000 was far better than 96 and 97, for example. But again, what I go back to just fundamentally is, I've sort of observed over the years this battle taking place between a number of groups, but if we had to boil it down to two different factions, it would be I suppose those who have accepted the reported figures at face value with no indication that further investigation may be needed. And then you've got other people who, as I said previously, have been a lot more skeptical and suspicious, and in some cases actually sort of cited specific elements which could have influenced those finalized numbers. And I suppose as being the only person who actually has access to all of this stuff that I know of, I was fortunately in a position to kind of reconcile those claims. And I think if you read the chapters again, you'll see that I don't take a position. It's sort of laid out. Here's what was recorded. Here's what, according to people who are actually controllers within the Turner organization, here's what they say this means, and then you can kind of take away from that what you might. So again, it's something that in every message that I've received so far about the book, it's one of the first things that people mention is this truly deep dive into a very controversial subject, which I think people now will know even more about.
Yeah, that's the best, because you're just introducing the facts, and people can look at the research and kind of analyze it themselves and kind of take what they want out of it. But that's kind of the best part for me, because it's like, here's the info, I'm looking at it all out on the table for you. Here's the cards.
Yes, and I would say, another specific example, without giving away the farm, that I can cite here is you look at 1997, for example. This was a year that obviously, you have Nitro defeating Raw in the Nielsen ratings for the entire calendar year, which was the only time that happened. Right from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, Nitro was the number one program. You have obviously the nWo becoming this major cultural phenomenon at that time, with the likes of Dennis Rodman and so on getting involved, and the popularity of that faction just spreading like wildfire. You have pay-per-views like Halloween Havoc, which did around 400,000 buys, and Starrcade, which was around 700,000, which was the high watermark for WCW. Those pay-per-views did huge business, and I think if you were to ask people, do you think WCW was a highly profitable entity for the year of 1997, they would think about some of those things that I just mentioned and say, well, of course. I mean, there's really no need to discuss anything there. It'd be hard to believe that they couldn't, or they hadn't been recognized for being such. But when you actually look at the income statement prepared by those within Turner for 97, it will tell you that within that corporation, they recognize WCW as making a profit of $824,000. That was the return that they calculated for 1997. And I go into, again, almost line item by line item, how they arrived at that figure. I'll give you one aspect of this, which, again, unless you are able to zero in on these confidential documents, this would be impossible to know. But something like, again, sticking with 1997, an interest expense which was allocated to WCW in the amount of $6.79 million. Let's just call it $6.8 million. And, if you look at the lending rates at that time, which were around sort of 8.25% to 8.5% during this era, interest of $6.8 million would basically imply, an inherited divisional debt or some kind of line of credit of around $80 million. So what I'm saying, to put it in a straightforward way, is for that interest to be directly attributable to WCW, they would have to be carrying forward around $80 million in debt, essentially. And when I ran this by, people who were involved in looking at some of these books, and people with highly developed, accounting knowledge and also institutional knowledge as it relates to Turner, their understanding was that WCW specifically didn't have any divisional debt. So how do we reconcile those things? How does that make sense? Well, when you understand that WCW was part of a category of other entities that were literally labeled as other on TBS's financial disclosures, what that means is, in the aggregate, all of the entities within that category, the revenues and expenses that were being generated by them could be reported on a financial statement without necessarily being attributed to the specific entities in which they occurred. So, in other words, WCW was grouped into a category with things like the CNN airport network and the Atlanta Braves. Well, under the accounting, generally accepted accounting principles and the accounting regulations at that time, there's nothing stopping you from saying, well, let's take some of this debt which has been accrued by other entities within this same category, and because we're having a pop here in terms of revenue with our wrestling division, because all of a sudden now it's apparently caught fire and it's making money hand over fist, we're going to offset that by shifting some of that debt to their books. And again, there's nothing illegal about doing that. You could say it's creative accounting, and there's no way to actually know that unless you've seen the specific income statements. You wouldn't be able to look on a financial disclosure on the SEC website and figure that out. It's not possible. So the performance of the category as a whole can look the same in consolidation, but be modified at the level of those individual companies. And so, I lay all that out, and again, include the comments of the insiders who were privy to the inner workings at that time. And then it's up to you as the reader to take away what you can from that. But I suppose the point that I'm making is, when we think about the financial performance of WCW, you might think about pay-per-view buy rates and ticket sales, of course, and merchandising and licensing, and all of these things are obviously integral to any wrestling company, especially back then. But what you're not necessarily going to think of is the allocated interest expense that may have come from, a sister company within Turner. So according to the information that I've been able to confirm, for what it's worth for people listening, over only a 4-year period, it's documented that $23.1 million in interest expense was allocated to WCW as a division. And so, again, you can kind of take that information for what it's worth. I do have partial data related to some other years during the WCW era that, at sort of printing time, I wasn't able to confirm to the extent where I'd be confident to go with it. So everything in the book is, something that is provable, that is documented. And as I said, over just a 4-year period there, we're talking about $23.1 million that, is set against revenues that WCW actually generated based on its activities as a wrestling division within Turner. So, again, I've kind of gone a couple of different tangents there, but I find this stuff, pretty interesting. I'm not sure about you, John.
Very interesting, and your level of detail is amazing. I just love to look at it. It's like, wait, so 95 profitable, 96, 97, 98, 99, but obviously what you get in depth in the first book and in this book, but it's like, man, they did some creative accounting, little shady, right, on their end. Like there's some stuff in there that's a little questionable.
Well, I suppose this goes back to sort of a fundamental aspect of this whole story, which was, within Turner, you have to ask yourself, what was WCW seen as? And according to, at this point, the hundreds of people that I've interviewed and people who are very close to Ted Turner himself, WCW was looked at above all else as programming. So again, this is what makes it very difficult to compare to, the reported profit or loss of a contemporary wrestling organization, for example. The structure was such that, as I mentioned, when there were years in which WCW was doing well as a standalone entity, those revenues appear to, according to the evidence, appear to have been used to offset expenses and interest and so forth that may have been accrued at other levels of the company. Another example would be 1998. Sometimes you you might come across a report that says WCW made $30 million in '98, or I think in Eric Bischoff's book, I believe, I'm going off the top of my head, but I believe the number that he was that he cited at that time was somewhere in the neighborhood of $55 million. Well, if you actually look at, again, what was the understanding within Turner, what did they have on their books? It was $9.586 million. And if I go into how they whittled it down to less than $10 million, I'd be giving away probably 3 pages of the book, and people can read about that.
Right.
But again, certainly some, let's just call them accounting adjustments that again are perfectly legal and can be done when you organize entities in that way. One of the stories that didn't make it into the book, I was talking to someone who used to have a sort of a standing meeting, I suppose, with the controller for the Atlanta Hawks. And basically, the Hawks were on paper a money loser every single year after year. And there was one year where they were, again, according to the books, they had lost $10 million. So this person said to the Hawks controller, is there going to come a point in time where the Hawks are going to be profitable? And the controller turned around and said, we don't want the Hawks to be profitable. That's not the function of, from an accounting standpoint, of that particular organization. So it's not just WCW where this kind of stuff was happening. It was happening at all levels of the organization, as it does, in many, if not all, large organizations, which are complex and involve different entities which may not always be have the strongest relationship to each other. And you just have to think about some of the incentives at play during this time. The fact that a lot of the compensation, for example, as it relates to the Turner executives, was based around things like revenue as opposed to net income or profit. So you can just imagine naturally the infighting if you're leading a division, John, and I'm leading a division, and maybe there's some revenue generating activity which is a point of contention, and I feel like, that should be credited to our books because we did the bulk of the heavy lifting there, and you may feel the same thing. You could see how this sort of political infighting would take place when people's bonuses are on the line. After all, and there's some quotes in these chapters about how, TBS was really revenue driven above all else. And that kind of has a lot to do with Ted's mindset also, which is sort of a longer discussion for another day. But it doesn't take very long to see and imagine how these sort of internal fights would occur. And seeing as WCW, again, based on the several hundred interviews that I've done for these 2 books, was, I think most people would agree, was commonly looked at as a redheaded stepchild. You can see how they would be left holding the bag, for lack of a better term, in many cases when these kind of fights over revenues and expenses went on. And this is the first time that we've been able to see all of that. All that we've had to this point is, different claims and somewhat compelling anecdotes and information, but like I said, almost on a line item by line item basis, all the information is here.
Yeah, that is amazing that you got that much detail and you're able to do that and get the line items and even interview guys like Dick Cheatham, who's unbelievable that you would be able to get him. So, I mean, there's some guys that you were interviewing and got, on record, not only for the first book, but for Beyond Nitro. God, it's amazing. Like Dick Cheatham. I mean, that's truly a great get.
Yeah, it's funny because, as I think we've probably talked about in the past, if you go back and look at that first book, there's the large majority of names were not names that I think even an avid, fan or viewer of WCW during its heyday would be familiar with. And that was one of the most gratifying, aspects of doing that book, was to highlight some of these people and in certain cases shine a spotlight on what they were responsible for and what they had to offer during what was, a great time in the wrestling business that we still remember so fondly. And Dick Cheatham was, just a invaluable source in terms of explaining some of the things that I just talked about, the incentives that were at play, the mindset of the executives, some of the infighting that went on. And, Greg Prince, who was the WCW controller, would be another person who was very much, just a wealth of information. And a lot of people on the Turner side. I mean, that was, something that I felt my understanding in doing this book, as well as really running this stuff by, people on the other side of the fence and trying to get as much information as I could to understand these documents, because as I'm sure and as I'm sure most people listening to this will know, within any organization, you have certain practices and certain methodologies, and even things like abbreviations and notations which are specific to that organization. So just having access to a document with raw information isn't necessarily enough to make sense of that picture. So that's where it's really helpful to kind of touch base with these people and, hey, what does this mean? What does this abbreviation refer to? What does this notation mean? And the more conversations you have, it's actually kind of fun. It's like putting together this giant jigsaw puzzle, and it takes a long, long period of time. I mean, this book was many years in the making, but it's something that I felt passionate about because, again, I didn't have the space to, take 50, 60 pages or whatever in the first book to really go into this stuff. So I wanted to do that here. And the chapters that we're talking about are just 2 chapters of 23 in the book. So there's, a ton more information as well. But this is the aspect of the of this volume, Beyond Nitro, which again most people have gravitated towards, and it's the part that I find really interesting as well.
Definitely, me too. And anything involving the nWo just completely fascinates me, and I just love it. Was obsessed with the nWo. So when you have stuff like vignettes that never made air, or Jenny Sloan, like the iconic logo. I mean, she actually designed it, and I guess really never really got the credit. Maybe she deserved for it, but it's just like stuff like that fascinates me, because the nWo, it was kind of like beyond pop culture. It was almost like just mainstream to the core. God, I was at a concert, and you see nWo shirts all over the place. So, I mean, it is like beyond, in the culture.
That's right. And I think the part of that story which I really grew to appreciate the most, and I don't think I would have known this prior to embarking on this whole journey of doing both the books, is to what extent so much of that storyline was spontaneous, and how a lot of the key contributions were not being developed out of this sort of top-down process, which I think sometimes is tempting to think about. Everything is being laid out on a storyboard, and it's all very deliberate and very calculated. And actually, you find out in talking to people that it was anything but. And I think much to the benefit of WCW and wrestling fans during that time. As you mentioned, the logo being developed in essentially a period of 1 hour. Neil Pruitt delivering the famous nWo voice, which again wasn't some sort of mastermind decision that was coming from up high. It was him messing around at the Disney MGM audio or studios one day and deciding to try out some different voices, and kind of realizing this would be a perfect backdrop for those nWo vignettes. People like Kemper Rogers, who was so instrumental in editing together, along with people like Neil, those black and white videos. And we could go on and on. So many contributions that, again, were not necessarily planned, but really helped, I would say, enhance, almost as kind of, these force multipliers that made it even bigger than it would have been had it just been, a cool storyline with, of course, the ultimate catalyst, which was that turn of Hulk Hogan. And I think, it's we can get into, and often it's inevitable not to address the fact that the storyline never had an ending. It just sort of fizzled out, and of course came back in different iterations. But a lot of people remain very unsatisfied with that to this day. And I would be in that camp as well. But equally, if you're going to, assign blame for why things didn't work out, or sort of lament that fact, you've also got to recognize that discussion would have been null and void had the phenomenon not occurred in the first place. If you would have had really anyone else, I mean, it's not even really anyone else. It's if you would have had anyone else playing that role of the third man and, turning and joining Nash and Hall, of course, it would have been, probably a hot storyline and a big deal for a period of time. No chance that it would have become the cultural phenomenon, as you mentioned, that it did. And I think it's really cool that we get a chance to recognize some of those contributors that hadn't got their due before. And that's something when it comes to wrestling books, and I suppose this genre of wrestling literature, I'm proud to have brought to the table is, yeah, we want to hear from the big names. We want to get their perspective, but just like any organization and any company, there's a whole army of people who help to put on screen what we enjoyed back then.
For sure. And I just love I just love Hogan, but I just love random Hogan stories. Obviously, without him, the NWO isn't what it is. Without him, wrestling is not what it is. But him wrestling at a private event, it's just like, wait, what? like why? How? What? How the hell is all this? Like stuff like that is awesome, because it's like stories you wouldn't hear anywhere else.
Yeah. So what you're referring to there is, this very bizarre occurrence which happened in October of '97, and I've put out some clips of this over the years and labeled it as such. And sometimes people will say, "Oh, this must be like October of '95 or '94 or something, because Hulk is in the red and yellow." And
right,
no,
yeah.
this was October of '97. It was actually a week before we mentioned that Halloween Havoc pay-per-view that year earlier. It was the week before that event where Hulk and Roddy Piper in the steel cage match, and Hulk goes and does this event that was filmed for the purpose of distribution, essentially, among people who worked for the company that were putting the entire thing on. It was called Commercial Financial Services. They were essentially a massive debt collection agency. And there's a really colorful story behind all that, which I spend quite a bit of time going into because it's pretty entertaining. They found themselves in a position where they really had money to burn. They were doing these extravagant excursions, taking the whole staff to Disney World. There's a story in there about how, the top executive, Bill Bartman at the company, decided to, pay for a private plane to go take a bunch of people to the NBA finals in, the heyday of the Chicago Bulls. And they literally, had money to burn during that time. And through some circumstances which people can read about, they decide to put on this company outing, I suppose, in Vegas. And we're going to kind of do this, this parody really of a wrestling show is essentially what it was. And we're going to have Michael Buffer there, as a ring announcer, and we're going to have Hulk Hogan and Brutus the Barber Beefcake, because of course he has to, he's going to be there when Hulk's there, right?
Of course.
And if I was to explain to you and the people listening the nature of what actually transpired that day, it would sound like a fever dream. So people, will probably enjoy getting into, okay, what exactly did Hulk do then? If he's abandoning the Hollywood Hogan persona, this is the height of the NWO, he's shedding that, and he's dressing up as Hulk Hogan, and he's putting on this shtick in front of, yes, thousands of people, but again, this is obviously prior to smartphones and so on and so forth. So I think it's safe to say this was being done under the understanding that very few people are ever going to see this. And if you kind of read about what transpired, I don't know, it's an interesting and very bizarre thing to consider, because I just think about if Stone Cold during the peak of his run was paid, a hefty sum to go and participate in kind of like a parody of wrestling at this private event, what would we as wrestling fans make of that, right? Maybe things like that don't matter as much as they used to, but I would suggest if you became aware of that in like 1998 if that story got out that a Stone Cold or a Rock or whoever, Undertaker, was kind of involved in something like that, it may have changed the way you sort of, I suppose, look at their persona, possibly. So yeah, that's a very bizarre, very intriguing story that I remember when I first presented that to Eric, and he said, "This is the first I'm ever hearing of this," and I said, "Was there whispers back then where did Hulk kind of let you know, like, hey, I'm doing this private gig?" He said, until you sent me the clip, he said, I had absolutely no idea that this ever took place. So it's fun to uncover stuff like that.
Wow, that's crazy because you would think he's the boss, like he would know everything his guys are up to, but not necessarily.
Yeah, and I mean, it's you might have your purists that would say, well, man, why do you have to go and do something like that like a week before a pay-per-view when you hear these guys talk about that era in wrestling with this reverence where we really were able to blur the line between reality and fiction, and people were reacting to what we were doing in the ring at times as if it was real, and they were losing themselves in the moment. So how do you square that with, like I said, a week before this really important pay-per-view? Well, we're going to throw the Hollywood Hogan character out the window, and we're going to portray, a babyface Hulk Hogan now, and we're going to be participating. And like I said, if you watch the entire thing, it's kind of like a parody, or it's a send up of all of the tropes of 90s wrestling, basically, Monday Night Wars era wrestling, and kind of peculiar. And it's you wonder in today's day and age, if it would be, I mean, I'm kind of answering my own question as I'm thinking about it. It wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't be possible for something like that to have escaped notice or to be widely known in today's day and age, because of course the second that something like that started, there would be 1,000 camera phones, and it would be on Twitter before you could even get your own phone out of your pocket. So it's something that was really unique to that time, and that was probably the last time that something like that could take place without it becoming a bigger story, I suppose.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, oh my God, like I can't believe that happened. You know what I mean? Just can't believe that could happen. But I guess if you have the money and you're going to kind of make a parody of it, and you don't think it's ever going to see the light of day, I guess you can almost get away with it.
Yeah, I think that was the thinking. Well, I suppose there probably wasn't too much thought. It was just, hey, this is a private event. They're paying good money. It's not like Hulk was in there taking bumps or doing anything like that. So you can certainly understand the motivation for doing it. But I suppose, eventually these things do have a way of coming to light. And again, that was, something I was really pleased to include as an added tidbit in the book.
So good. Maybe the most fascinating thing to me, because I actually watched it, believe it or not. I actually
Mm.
have seen this before, but the Dusty Rhodes, I don't even know like what it was, but I saw he was on it, and it was
Yeah.
like racing. It was boat racing, but it wasn't really boats. They were buggies or whatever you want to call it, but it was Florida. So
Swap
I was like,
buggies.
"Oh my gosh, like what is this?" I think it was like the Nashville Network or whatever the heck it was on. Yeah, that
Mhm.
Swamp Buggies, exactly. Yeah, I was like, "Wow, he actually got this." I was like, I thought it was like a fever dream, like too. Like there's no way this actually like existed, but he literally was doing it. I saw it on TV.
Yeah, so we have a chapter in there about and again, just to explain this to people, the way that this book is structured, these chapters are, for the most part, standalone chapters. They're self-contained, as opposed to the first book, which again is this mammoth chronological story. Obviously, having gone through the entire story from beginning to end, I wasn't going to do that again for the another book. So what you'll see is, the book is broken down into 3 parts. So you have Untold Stories, which is part 1, which is getting into some of the things that we've just been talking about. The Hulk Hogan private event thing, the Dusty story, which I'll address in a second. Part 2 is, a deep dive on, it's called Where the Big Boys Played, and it's a deep dive on all of these areas which I think are integral to this subject, which again didn't necessarily have time or space to cover in the first book. So things like WCW's finances, things like the company's historical Southern lineage, which I think is something that hasn't quite been replicated by any national promotion, at least since. Things like the relationship between the video games, which were a huge deal at that time, and how I think some of those THQ titles in particular really introduced tons of people to the wrestling business, and even for those people who were already fans, enhanced their own enjoyment of it. So I have a whole chapter in there going into the history of THQ and the WCW nWo Revenge, seminal game, and some of the titles that followed, which I think people will really enjoy. And then the final part 3, is getting into some of the changes that have occurred in the wrestling business since 2001, since WCW went away. So just laying that out to give people an idea of how this all fits. The Dusty chapter, as you mentioned there, talks about the intersection between, wrestling and racing, I suppose you could say, that took place when the Nashville network at the time decided to, I suppose, capitalize on wrestling's popularity by introducing a soap opera element to its presentation of Motor Madness. So, we're not just going to have these wacky swamp buggy races or monster truck competitions, but we're actually going to envelop this all in, I suppose they would have considered it a wrestling-inspired storyline. People can go on YouTube and look at some of the clips and make their own minds up about that. But to kind of be one of the anchors to explain all of that, they hired Dusty Rhodes to be a color commentator. And, in doing so, he really made an impact on a number of his broadcast colleagues, and I think is very fondly remembered by a lot of people on that show. And so that chapter talks about what ultimately happened to that experiment and why it became, controversial and sort of the lasting memories that people have of Dusty's involvement to this day. So that's definitely another one of my favorite chapters for sure.
That's great stuff. So I was like, I feel like I just made this up in my head. I saw him doing these races. It's like, oh my God, he's gonna cover it in detail. This is great. Somebody else actually knows that this existed. Just so fascinating. Like, wow, that's so weird, but true. Yeah. Crazy.
Yeah. And especially when I think this is covered in the chapter, you had these I hesitate to, I'll use the word, very well established, professional, legitimate broadcasters who were used to being on the air and calling, motorsports in a professional way. And all of a sudden, as we talk about in the book, they're pulled into a room and they're given a 62-page script of, this is how we're going to present this program from now on. And it's not just going to be the races, it's going to be these vignettes, and it's going to be antics and hijinks, and for some reason we're going to have Dusty gambling in a casino, and all of these wacky things, which again I suppose is something that could have only happened during that time. And I think a lot of it was motivated by perhaps a lack of confidence in these events being able to draw on their own. I think the thinking was, wrestling's taking off. We feel like there's some crossover here in terms of people who may be interested. So why don't we present some kind of a hybrid or blend of these two worlds? And, safe to say, I don't think it made for a lot of memorable and entertaining moments, but I don't think the idea, worked out too great in the end.
Yeah, not too great, for sure. But as we head for the wind up, we'll head towards the finish, because I could literally talk to you forever. Obviously, you've been on the show a few times, so I could talk to you forever about wrestling, especially WCW, especially your books, because you're so detailed and you always have just amazing amount of analysis and research and everything put into the book. So I mean, just phenomenal. But I got to just throw this out there for you. CIA, WCW, like, just how do you find some of this stuff? Like, it's amazing.
Oh man, yeah, there was a person that I was able to get in touch with a couple of years back who, again, don't want to give too much away, but someone who interviewed with WCW, someone who was connected with some big players and certainly had an awareness of what was going on during this time. Ended up not getting hired, and decided to pivot into the natural next landing spot, right after you've interviewed with WCW and have been hired. Okay, I'm gonna work for the CIA, and the person that I interviewed, again, I don't want to give away too many details, but just an immensely impressive individual who has life experience and knowledge that is very hard to come by in life. But the origin of his journey and how he got to becoming a CIA officer for decades, and being in some very high profile rooms with leaders from all over the world, a lot of it traces back to his interest in wrestling and who he met during that time. And as I mentioned, the interview that he had, which at that time was kind of like his dream occupation, was to work in the wrestling business. And so he talks about some of the similarities, believe it or not, that he witnessed between the two worlds, having been on the periphery, I suppose, maybe even a little bit closer with WCW, and then going on to work for an intelligence agency. So I knew I had to find a way to include that in the book, and really happy with how that turned out. And it's always gratifying to do something to surprise a reader, because if you cast a wide net and you speak to enough people and you put in the hard work and you do your research, you're going to come across some really unique and interesting and off the wall stories that help you repay the time that your readers are spending in picking up one of your books. So yeah, I would love people to go and check out the book and let me know what you think about that.
Yeah, you definitely do great detail, because there has been WCW books before, but they were almost more, I don't know, not as analytical, if you will. I mean, there's just not as much research going on. It's kind of on the surface stuff. This stuff, Beyond Nitro especially, man, you get into the nitty gritty and you cover some stuff, whether it's WCW payroll, whether it's the CIA story, which is great, the Dusty Rhodes story, the Hulk stuff, the whole private event, the nWo, the nWo logo. I mean, just some great stuff. So please tell everybody where they can get Beyond Nitro.
Well, let me just say, John, thank you very much for the invite, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And as I think I may have mentioned the last time we spoke, or before that, you mentioned the word historian before. I mean, you have to put yourself firmly in that category with the archive of shows that you have at this point, and the success that you're still having. Hats off to you, because it's a treasure trove of information for anyone who's interested in researching or writing about the wrestling business. So I just wanted to make sure I include that. In terms of where people can pick up the book, Amazon is certainly a place to go. The book is available on all of the different Amazon platforms: paperback, hardcover, Kindle. There's an audiobook which is in development. I do think probably in the next 6 to 8 weeks we'll have that up on Audible as well. So if people, we do have a sort of a list for people who are interested in the audiobook, because there are a lot of them. So if you wanted to send me an email at GuyEvansWCWbook@gmail.com, we can add you to that list and let you know as soon as it goes live on Audible. But even if you don't want to get added to that list, as I said, check back in 6 or 8 weeks and it should be there. So Amazon, and then if you really want to support my work and ensure future wrestling titles, I suppose the best place to go would be GuyEvansBooks.com. And you can also get signed copies of the books there and everything else. So hope people check it out. Again, it's called Beyond Nitro, Untold Stories of the WCW Era. That's the subtitle. And if you enjoyed some of the things we talked about today, I'm sure you'll certainly enjoy this book as well.
Thank you for the great compliment coming from you, calling me a historian. That's quite high praise. Thank you so much.
No, you're certainly welcome, Joe. I mean, have you ever sat down and tried to calculate how many hours of audio you've put together over, what is it now, a dozen years, if not more?
Yeah. Oh my God. You're right. Now that I think about it, I can't even calculate it. I would have to really sit down and think about how many hours it's been. Holy moly.
Yeah, and I mean, and you've had big gets and big guests yourself, and I think hopefully you feel like it was time very well invested, because, like I said, anyone who's interested in really digging into any era of the wrestling business is going to find, multiple hours of audio, if not much more, just from your podcast alone. So, think about over these last 12 years, a lot of podcasts have come and gone, right? There's a lot that were popular for a time and they disappear off the map. The archives are inaccessible. And so for you to have the body of work that you've put together, I mean it sincerely, great job.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. But of course, everybody should get out there and get Beyond Nitro, and really any of your books. They're all amazing. The Bischoff, the Penzer, the original Nitro. Just everybody get out there and buy all of Guy's books. So Beyond Nitro. Guy, thank you so much for all the time. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Look forward to next time. Thanks, John.